Okay, so let's start talking now about our end goal. I think it's good to have our end goal stated right up front. I've shown you how everything can go wrong, and now I'm going to show you what we're looking for. The ego, the self, is just as large here as the superego or adult and the inner child. The bad parent we have now changed to a good and loving parent. I will show you how to do that in the course. That's the internal. This can't be an external therapist. I don't believe. An external therapist who is like this, or an external coach who is like this, will help. But our job should be for the client to be carrying a new recording or a new archetype or template inside of them at the unconscious level of a good and loving and supportive parent who is giving them love and validation. The inner child now feels safe. All of that splitting and all of the emotional flashback trauma responses are a sort of an animalistic thrashing around, panicked, anxious attempt to get back to safety and away from danger over a long enough period and with enough trauma. That can be like somebody's hardwired way of responding. So we need to take that hardwiring, undo it and rewire it so that the inner child feels safe and emotionally re-regulated. Emotional dysregulation, which is one of the subjects that we're going to be dealing with a lot on this course, can alter your perception, and that can have really, really catastrophic consequences for your life over a period of 30, 40 years. So the inner child is feeling good and feeling safe. The bad parent is now a good parent. The inner dialogue now is supportive inner dialogue. The ego is now broadened, expanded, full. The person comes back into themselves. They start to inhabit their own body and their own space. They can now thrive and get on with their lives. And instead of being focused on the past and living with these god-awful, torturous recordings playing inside of them, they can now be present-centered and focused on feeling good and having a supportive and strong inner dialogue that leads them in the directions they want to go in their lives. How are we going to do that? Well, my background is in martial arts, and I trained people. I had a globally recognized brand for about 10 years there in the self-protection community, and I trained people from policemen to special forces guys to bodyguards and nightclub security, men and women all over the world. And it gave me a certain focus in my training. I do have a psychology background. I've got a degree in psychology, and I'm qualified in neuro-linguistic programming. I was qualified in neuro-linguistic programming, and as a hypnotherapist, I think my first qualification I got when I was 18, when I was very, very young. And I learned a certain way of teaching people and helping people. When it came time for me to explore doing therapy and counseling work with people, I still adopted the same approach, which is a slightly more assertive, aggressive approach. Rather than being focused on the pain that the person is in, the suffering that the client is going through, I start to look at, well, what are their strengths and what are their weaknesses? What do they need to be stronger in? What can we, as coaches and as therapists, strengthen for them so that they can start to have the personal serenity and independence to tackle these problems for themselves? And I've identified certain key skill sets that are really important for this course. By the time the client has gone through all of these skill sets, I claim that their CPTSD symptoms will be completely gone. Whether that means the trauma, the childhood trauma, is completely resolved for life, I wouldn't want to go that far. But the symptoms should be completely gone. It's a pretty bold claim. But once you've seen what's inside of the course, you'll know why I'm making such a bold claim. So confidently, it's not for nothing. It's because there's actually a lot here that people need. One of my skill sets disappeared off the screen. Don't worry, I'll turn the camera down. You'll get all this in a much, much nicer format in the later videos. So here are the skill sets. First one is emotional literacy. I have a whole course on emotional literacy, What we're going to do is we're going to teach the client to get back in touch with their emotions, to process those emotions, to honor those emotions as a part of themselves, as a way of making them stronger. We're going to reteach the client, if you are the client, we're going to reteach you that your emotions are not something to be fearful of, but they are messengers who are bringing you messages that are there to support you, even though those messages and the messenger can be annoying or frightening or disruptive. Its purpose is a positive intent. And if we turn our attention, our present-centered awareness to the message and hear the message, it will stop that from happening. So that's the emotional literacy side of the course that we're going to delve into. We're going to teach the client mental toughness. The psychological term would be resilience. CPTSD and long-term trauma over a long enough timeline can make people, they can still be tough to all intents and purposes. They can take a lot of pain, they can deal with a lot of stuff. It can make us, CPTSD sufferers like myself, vulnerable to strange things and to unusual triggers. And it's very, very common for people with CPTSD to be told, oh wow, I can't believe that you can put up with this, this, and this, and that you work so many hours and you can do this, this, and this. But then in another area of life, they're like, what's wrong with you? Why can't you deal, like you can deal with 2 years of this horror, but you can't deal with 2 minutes of that, which everybody seems to be able to deal with. There is a lack of resilience on certain key issues. People with CPTSD, because of the splitting in the inner child, can be extremely resilient, extremely mentally tough with certain subjects, and then another subject, usually pertaining to issues of self-identity or emotional intimacy, have very low levels of resilience to stress. And that can manifest as, because of the low resilience to stress on those trigger issues, it will either manifest as emotional flashbacking, or it can go into people becoming very, very defensive to the point of hostility, and it almost looks like they're seeking conflict. They're not. They're actually trying to protect their perceived vulnerabilities from a perceived threat, just in a very non-direct way, and in an ineffectual way. There's an interesting piece of English. In an ineffectual way. Why? Because of the emotional dysregulation that I mentioned earlier, that we're going to hopefully completely heal on this course, which affects people's perception. And it makes people, because the perception is altered and the emotions are dysregulated, what happens is they will have a disproportionately large amount of emotion to slightly odd things, and a disproportionately limited amount of emotion to slightly odd things. So they'll be feeling a lot about something that they probably shouldn't be feeling that much about, and they'll be feeling very, very little about something that you'd be like, God, you really should do something about that. We'll deal with that. So that will be part of the emotional literacy and of increasing the individual's resilience, their mental toughness, their capacity to deal with stress, to be assertive, and to go for what they want and to get it. Self-praise is no praise at all, they say, but I think this is probably the most powerful part of the course that I've created. I'm surprised that nobody's come up with it before, but the reparenting process, I'm not going to talk about it much here. I'm just going to let that section speak for itself. In essence, and in principle, what we're going to be looking at is taking that archetype, that recording of the bad parent that is inside of the client, and we're going to change it into a good and loving parent, and then we're going to reinstall it. It's talking about people like their computers and like these are pieces of software, and that's quite deliberate. That's kind of how this process is going to work and how that's going to look. We're going to look at state management. Most of the people who show up with CPTSD, we tend to abandon ourselves, we tend to abandon our own needs, and that means that we're not taking care of ourselves properly, and that we don't look internally even to see what our state is. Most of us are not even aware that we can influence. We can do things that would influence our state and make ourselves feel better. Why does this happen? Probably because in childhood we would have been punished for having needs. We would have been punished for saying, hey, I'm hungry, hey, I'm thirsty. Punished so severely that over time the child simply learns, you're not allowed to have feelings. You're not allowed to feel thirsty or hungry. You're not allowed anything at all. And so teaching state management is a good way of teaching the individual to notice that they have a state, and secondly, that they can do things for themselves that will help them. When people have hangovers, when people are drunk, when people are abusing narcotics, when people are not sleeping properly, when they're not eating properly, when they're not exercising properly, when they're in a bad physical state, they're way more vulnerable to the recordings of the inner critic. They're way more vulnerable to emotional flashbacks. This then makes them feel badly about themselves. They feel badly about the world. They do bad things because they're focused on negative things, and they produce a lot more chaos and shit for themselves. It comes back around and they go, see, I knew the world was a shitty place and I was a shitty person, and it becomes like a self-fulfilling prophecy. The state management is a really, really good way of breaking that cycle and going, hey, you totally don't have to do that anymore. There are other things you can do that are going to make you feel better, like night and day, between today and tomorrow. I mean, there's no reason. All of this is fast. The emotional literacy is probably the slowest. It's going to take, there's exercises in here that will probably, you should, conservatively be expecting to be doing for the next 3 months for them to fully work. Mental toughness, well, a large part of that is listening to an audio hypnosis, 7 days, and you will be mentally tougher. Reparenting, a longer one, maybe not 3 months, maybe months to 6 weeks. State management, instant, listen to it, like literally listen to a piece of advice and then go, fuck, I could totally do that whilst I'm listening to the piece of advice to make myself feel better. Yes, you can breathe deeper, smile, stand up, stretch your back. Straining the back feels good to humans. Lifting the head feels good. Doing this with your face feels good. Drinking water feels good. You could totally do that whilst listening to me doing all the other stuff. The critical thinking, I've called it critical thinking because I wanted it to sound normal. Like layman's terms, the more psychobabbly way of describing it would be teaching people to have boundaried thinking. In this bad model of reality, this bad parent is smashing the boundaries of the child as they're supposed to be developing and causing this unboundaried sort of shrunken person to be here. So there's very, very few boundaries going on. Now, where should the boundaries be developing? What boundaries is the parent smashing? The boundaries that should be developing is the child should be learning the difference between my need and your need, for one. That's one thing. But the parent imposes the needs upon the child so that the child grows up into an adult who, whenever they're in an intimate relationship, because your intimate sexual relationships with people are going to reflect most deeply the relationship you had with your parent. That's the nature of what they in the psychology world, that's called attachment trauma. So it's love trauma. Attachment is just love. And in psychoanalysis, they'll say attachment to first object. The first object, I don't know why psychoanalysis chose these terms, but the first object is the parent, primal object, parent. Attachment to object is loving, in normal speak, is loving mummy and loving daddy. The way I love my mummy and the way I love my daddy is the way I love myself. The way I love my mummy and the way I love my daddy is the way I can love another human being who I'm either in a friendship with or it's a sexually intimate relationship. These traumas in the way I love my mummy or my daddy, with the breaks in the pattern, the particular weird, like twisted, creepy, boundary breaking, emotional incest patterns that play out, that's the thing that I'm going to play out with my partner. That's attachment trauma. So that's one boundary that can break, where the bad parent imposes their wants onto the child. The child then can't tell the difference between my want and your want. When the partner has a want, the partner is now forced into the role through basically trauma-based projective identification. That sounds complex. It's not really. It just means you've learned to think about the world and think about reality in a certain way. You start feeling your partner's feelings for them as though they were yours. And you will put feelings into them that they don't have. That's called projection. It's a very normal human thing to do. People with CPTSD do it more because imagine, let's say this poor person, let's imagine this is me. Again, it's good to use me as an example, rather than me saying you all the time, saying me. So you can be objective and you can sit there. If you're a client, you should train yourself to think like a therapist, think like a coach, think like a counselor. So imagine I'm sat here and I'm going, well, I believe I'm a piece of shit. And I developed a relationship with a girl who actually really, really loves me. But I'm carrying the recording inside of myself as I'm not lovable. And I feel unlovable. And I say, I'm not lovable. and she's like, but I totally love you, she might do something like change the channel on the TV, and I'll be like, you did that because you hate me and you want me to leave right now. You're secretly hoping that I'll leave so that you can have sex with your lover that you've been with since day one. Yeah. Some of you are laughing, and some of you are going, damn, that sounds like me. That sounds just like my life. It's not your fault that that plays out, but the fact that it plays out is part of emotional dysregulation. What I didn't say before, emotional dysregulation causes psychosis. I mean, I joke about this stuff because it helps people to like break through the sort of like the stickiness of the subject and to give them a new perspective. But when you are emotionally dysregulated and you're in a lot of intense emotional flashbacks, your perceptions get very, very, very distorted. I didn't realize until I made myself get help, which somebody with CPTSD can't usually do, and go to therapy. And the therapist made me do, she can't make me, but you know, she encouraged me to journal my thoughts and my feelings in a not very structured way. It wasn't the best piece of advice anybody's ever given me in therapy, but I noticed through journaling my thoughts and my feelings, I could go back a week or a month later and be like, I don't remember writing that. I remember I wrote something in a journal that was so alien to me that I was convinced for a while, I had a paranoid delusion that somebody had hacked my computer and had written it for me. Because I'd shown up as a person and had written a thing, and the other version of me, it's getting into dissociative identity disorder, not quite, but you know, pushing in that direction. And I was like, I don't recognize that. I don't recognize that belief. I don't recognize that strategy for dealing with such a belief. That's not me. So the boundaries break. And here's another way in which the boundaries break, not just between you and other people, but on the inside, between your own personalities, between who you are on different days, between what you think and what you feel. Now, this is very, very important, and it is where the world is going in a bad direction. If we want to get back to this place where we're feeling good, there's a supportive inner dialogue, and we're thriving, and you have an inner child that is in emotional dysregulation and in emotional flashbacks, it's going to be they're so intense, it's going to be very, very hard for you to tell the difference between what you think and what you feel. When you become emotionally re-regulated again, you have a boundaried approach to your inner world, and you're like, I feel as though this person doesn't really like me, but logically, they've done this, this, and this. So I guess my inner Sherlock Holmes is kind of demanding that through pure crystal logic, the truth must be more like this than the way that I actually feel. Maybe I shouldn't trust the way I feel. Maybe the way I feel is rooted in childhood trauma. This is good supportive inner dialogue that is using critical thinking skills that allow us to lay down boundaries. When you are in pain or you need something, that's you are in pain and you need something. When you want something from me, you must ask me. Similarly, my boundaries are not just to be asserted with other people. My boundaries are to be asserted with myself. If I want something from somebody, the right way to go about getting it is to go into a good state and to ask them politely, please, to give me the thing that I want. This can be incredibly hard for people with CPTSD. It's hard for humans to do. So my hope is when you actually develop all of these skills fully and consciously, you'll actually be stronger, more conscious and more switched on and more capable than a normal person, a neurotypical person, whatever you think is the appropriate way to describe it. Or you could just say somebody who didn't go through what I went through in childhood, somebody who doesn't have long-lasting childhood trauma that's caused them to struggle to live a normal life. Once you've developed all these skills, you actually will have an advantage over people. Critical thinking is the ability to critique your own thinking style and to go, how do I know that that is true? I have just asserted that I believe that all X's are always Y. Has there ever been a case when an X wasn't a Y? Has there ever been a case when, it's actually thinking, becoming boundaried, boundaries between my thoughts and my feelings, boundaries between the different sides of myself, boundaries between myself and the outside world, boundaries between myself and with you. A lot of that comes down to critical thinking and the capacity to be clear, to draw your thinking, your crown chakra, Om Shanti Shanti, out of the morass of the emotional storm that's going on and go, aha, I can see things clearly now. Okay, the thing that is out of shot it says emotional flashback management. I will point at it so you have the fulfillment of seeing it. There, you feel fulfilled now. Good. The only thing that was missing, I think, was the word management there. Emotional flashback management. So we're actually going to look at developing a skill set that is specific to emotional flashbacks that allows us to tackle emotional flashbacks directly. This is a short course. It only has 5 components. You must do it. It's not a sit back and just listen to the exercises and suck it in. You've actually got to do this. Look, the truth is, if you do this, you develop this, you have this, you develop this, and you develop this, you probably won't need this. But my hope for this course is to offer you a belt and braces approach where we cover all the bases so that you walk away from it going, holy shit, that was amazing. I feel like a whole new person. Remember, if you're on 0 to 5 on the CPTSD scale, I personally believe that if you're diligent and you can, without the inner critic stopping you or self-sabotaging you as you move forward, I believe if you stick with the exercises, the longest one goes on for about 3 months, you keep listening to the audio hypnosis, you keep doing the exercises, you keep doing the work, you can get a hell of a long way in curing your CPTSD inside of 2 to 3 months. If you're at 5 to 10 on the scale, all of this needs to be done very gently, very carefully, and very skillfully with a coach or with a therapist who's only going to move you through the skill sets as quickly as you can cope with it. The most important thing, and the one we start with, is developing your emotional literacy so that you can come back to yourself, so that you can start honoring yourself and who you really are. Okay guys, that's it for this section. I hope you enjoyed that, and I look forward to talking to you in section 3. Thank you.